The Louvre is home to works by some of the greatest artists of our time, and the iconic Glass Pyramid by I.M. Pei stands as a testament to work which was argued to have been ahead of its time. But back in 1989, when the Louvre reopened after a 15-year renovation project, Pei came under scrutiny from critics and locals alike. For one, not being French, and two, for degrading their heritage site with the Glass Pyramid. But the president at the time, François Mitterrand, handpicked Pei and was not the only one who stood by Pei's vision.
We wanted, with François Mitterrand and Pei and our staff, realize a dream. This Louvre was dirty, abandoned, and very few visitors. And our dream was to realize one of the most beautiful museums in the world. And this ambition, we could realize it because Pei was a courageous, intelligent, creative man.
Io Ming Pei was born in Guangzhou, China in 1917 and moved to the US at the age of 18 to study architecture at MIT and Harvard, landing his first job designing skyscrapers before he established his own independent design firm in 1955. His big break came when he designed the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library in Boston. Pei always stayed connected to his roots and stayed away from designing the Western way, but instead fusing cultures. He designed this striking steel and glass Bank of China skyscraper in Hong Kong, which at the time was the 5th tallest building in the world.
Design concept and his philosophy, he's devised the scheme of using the Chinese philosophy of the bank will be perforated like the bamboo going up section by section.
Pei painstakingly researched each project, studying its use and relation to its surroundings. I believe that architecture is a pragmatic art. To become art, it must be built on a foundation of necessity, he once said. Pei's designs have always been influenced by his love of Islamic architecture, with one of his later commissions, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, making the perfect canvas for the artist who was 91 years old at the time. While his name and work have been solidified into the history books, his designs will continue to inspire generations to come.
That's why a master is able to incorporating all the different elements in life into a building.
To talk about how I.M. Pei created those crisp, precise buildings and left an indelible mark on the contemporary landscape, his biographer, Michael Cannell, joins me now. Michael, in your book, I.M. Pei, Mandarin of Modernism, you've described him as a contradiction. Why?
I would say he was a contradiction most obviously in the sense that he designed some of America's most iconic buildings. You could go to a dozen American cities. I'm thinking about Boston, Dallas, Denver, and he would have designed the building that became a kind of icon, a civic monument in that city, and yet he wasn't American. He was an immigrant, and yet he would come to these communities, city after city, and kind of become an important part of that city, both in terms of the architecture and his personal presence, his personality.
He said when you're building in the middle of history, you have to take history into account. You can't just go ahead and dance around. How do you think he did that?
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting question. When I think there are a lot of ways in which his childhood in Shanghai informed his philosophy as an architect. He grew up, spent part of his childhood in an ancient garden outside of Shanghai where one generation would put rocks into a stream, and those rocks would be sculpted over time. They would be left for future generations to enjoy and appreciate. And I think that's part of the way he thought as a designer, that buildings were not just for today, but that they were for the future. He took an extremely long view.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, his designs share some common threads, like the geometrical detail, or like light and shape and transparency and all that. But then I think you can't really necessarily identify his buildings as I.M. Pei's, and I feel like this must be intentional. Can you talk me through that, please?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, in his prime, I.M. Pei was the most famous architect in America, if not in the world. And yet, as you say, he didn't really have an identifiable style. You could look at the meteorological laboratory that he built outside of Denver, and you could look at the glass pyramid that he built at the Louvre. It would be very hard to believe that they were designed by the same architect, right? So he didn't really have a signature style. And I think part of that is about him suppressing his own ego, suppressing his own identity, and putting forward what the client needed, what the place needed, what the time needed. He was a very rational architect, very thoughtful, and he really studied what the client needed in this place, and he sort of reduced the design to a series of factors and boiled all of it down to a real essence, and that's what ended up being built. I think what he had was a signature personality, not a signature style, but a signature personality.
So, just like you said, suppressing, or rather maybe controlling his ego in an age of architects, do you think was the key to his success then?
Well, I think it was his diplomacy. I think that I.M. Pei was not necessarily the most gifted architect of his generation in a purely artistic sense. Architects use the word form giver. He wasn't the greatest form giver of his time. That would be Louis Kahn. But he was the greatest diplomat. He had a very particular kind of charm, and he had a very particular way of communicating, not just with his client, but with the community. And he went to great lengths to communicate with the community, to get to know the place where he was building. And as much as anything, I think that's his legacy.
Well, Michael Cannell, this is all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on Showcase today.
Thank you for having me.